Welcome to the Dr. J Vlog series. It is Monday, March 3rd, 2025, and on Mondays we look into mathematics and statistics. And following up from last week, I promised to take a little bit of a deeper dive into cost of living issues. So I want to talk a little bit broadly today about the cost of living in Canada versus the US, and a little bit more specifically on occasion comparing Ontario and Virginia, as I've lived in over 30 years in both places, respectively, because I'm in my 60s. Okay, so where would you like to live? Okay. I mean, there are countless factors that would affect that decision, but if you had a completely open choice, you could live wherever you wanted. For example, would you rather live on top of a mountain or a ridge overlooking a forest? Or would you prefer a home on the beach, overlooking the ocean, or a beautiful lake? That's a tough one for me personally. But there are so many other factors to consider as well, right? If you're talking about the quality of one's housing, specifically where the nature of the dwelling, the rooms, etc., the location, especially vis-a-vis work, depending on whether you work at home or not, the schools in the area, especially if you have children, cultural amenities, options, opportunities, sporting and recreational activities, and much more. But one thing that always matters, no matter who we are, at least in our societies, would be the issue of affordability. So can we afford to live comfortably in our homes in the specific towns or cities where we live? That typically is going to be tied to our jobs as well, and the flexibility that we may or may not have with respect to where we can work or whether we can work from home and so forth. I don't have the exact figures, but most people are going to move at some point in their professional working lives in conjunction with a job or even a career change. On a global scale, it's estimated that as many as 300 million people emigrate annually to a new country altogether, and or well over 3% of the world's population. Of course, most of us who live in Canada and the United States plan to stay in these respective countries, although historically and proportionally more Canadians have moved to the US, certainly in recent decades, than vice versa. More recently, I've certainly heard some talk about people being unhappy with where they are and wanting to move for various reasons. According to the latest polling data, about 1 in 5 folks in the US have expressed a desire to leave the country. And last year, while there were proportionately fewer Canadians who expressed that desire, we should note too that about 2 in 5 newcomers stated that they'd consider looking for another place to live because mainly of the housing affordability issues in Canada. But beyond the politics of the respective countries, let's focus more precisely on that latter issue of affordability. Can you afford to live in Canada or in the US from an economic standpoint? The answer in both cases would be mostly a yes. Yes, you can. The US poverty rate is estimated to be about 13% in 2022, about 10% in Canada. That's not something that we need to brag about. They're calculated differently. Those rates are not strictly comparable because they're constructed in different ways. Still, we know that the vast majority of people in both countries are at least working class, with strong numbers in the middle classes and even in the upper classes from an economic standpoint. And about 2/3 of the folks in both countries, again, we don't know the exact figure. I mean, we have estimates, but I'm just rounding off here to say that about 2/3 of people in both countries own their own homes. That's usually an aspiration for most people as they're getting older, as they get into the workforce and so forth. And both countries have historically had strong educational systems, reasonably high literacy rates, graduation rates, political stability, and generally high qualities of life. You really can't go wrong whether you're talking about living in the US or Canada from an economic standpoint, from a quality of life standpoint. I want to drill down a little bit further, though. again, more purely from an economic standpoint, what about the wages and the salaries in both countries? So let's start at the bottom. The government of Canada just released the following statement. Quote, strong economies invest in their workforces and the hardworking people that make them run. Resilient economies ensure that workers have the tools and supports they need to not only get ahead, but to stay there. That's why today the government is increasing the federal minimum wage to $17.75 per hour on April 1st, 2025. So that's a 2.4% increase. Now, to be clear, in Canada, the federal minimum wage is adjusted annually as of April 1st each year based on Canada's annual average consumer price index, CPI, relative to the previous calendar year. So it really is kind of a cost of living adjustment, rounded to the nearest nickel. So the policy's been there to keep pace with the year-by-year increases in the cost of living, but especially for Canadians then who are working part-time, temporary work, or lower minimum wage jobs. So employers then have to adjust their information, their salary, their payroll expenditures accordingly to ensure that they are paid, that their employees are paid with the new rates as of April 1st. And should the provincial or territorial minimum wage exceed the federal rate, employers have to pay the higher of the two. In the U.S., the federal minimum wage for covered non-exempt employees continues to be $7.25 per hour. Many states have their own independent minimum wage laws. In cases where the employee is subject to both the state and federal minimums, the employee is entitled to the higher of the two minimum wages as well. I did mention last week, though, that there really is a great degree of variability from state to state across the 50 U.S. states. More than a dozen, though, continue to use the $7.25 minimum, and some go up much higher, more comparable to the Canadian rates. So obviously, we have to recognize, too, that the cost of living is going to vary substantially, depending upon where you live in each of the countries and even across different parts of a given state or province as well. So in Ontario, for example, I found that the housing prices are literally almost twice as high in Toronto, where I lived for about 20 years, compared to London, Ontario, where I've lived for most of the past decade. As a second example, in Northern Virginia, which is where I grew up, the cost of housing there is far greater than in most anywhere else in Virginia, with homes averaging more than $1 million across several of the Northern Virginia zip codes. The housing and cost of living prices are much lower as you move out west to the more mountainous parts of the state and as you move to the south and southwest. So if we look at overall cost of living in both Virginia and Ontario, we see actually remarkable similarity. Again, these are large swaths of land in both countries. But and so there's going to be variability across these, spatially across the different regions. But first, if you just look at Virginia, the Bureau of Economic Analysis estimates that the average Virginian spent just over $48,000 a year to keep themselves afloat back in 2021. And so that includes the combination of housing and utility cost of almost $9,000, healthcare cost, just over $7,100 out of pocket, food and beverage, about $3,700, gas and energy goods, over $1,000, over $1,100, and then all other personal expenditures, catch-all category with all kinds of stuff in it, but that's about $27,000 as well. Excuse me. In Ontario, the average cost of living, according to the living wage index, is estimated to be about $3,600 in Toronto. On a countrywide basis, in 2021, the average cost of living in Canada per month for a couple was about $3,500, or about $42,000 per year. So to achieve that standard, you need an income of around $80,000 per year if one person works, or or $80,000, you'd have to have $40,000 each for each of you combined. Put another way, A couple with both partners working 40 hours per week at minimum wage in Canada would have a combined income of about $70,000. So not quite enough, but fairly close. Okay. And that's the biggest difference, I think, in my view, between Canada and the US. That is, it's much harder to sustain yourself on a minimum wage position in many places in the US compared to Canada. On the other hand, average salaries overall in the United States have tended to be significantly higher than in Canada, with an estimated median salary now of about 70 grand per year in the United States. And then if you adjust for the exchange rates, that translates into about 51,000 annually in Canada. So there's quite a gap there. Again, we're talking about the median salary. So recall that a median indicates, or it's the midway point or the cut point in a distribution. So 50% are above, 50% are below the median figure, technically speaking. So, and there are also relatively more people, I would say, who have the opportunity in the US to make the really big money compared to Canada. US has sort of always been the ultimate destination for those people who are really sort of hoping to make it big financially. And I think that's arguably still the case even today. In terms of overall spending patterns and quality of life, I have to point out that there are, again, some major differences, especially on the policy front, that directly affect individual and family economic bottom lines. So because we're taxed at a higher rate in Canada, we do tend to have lower overall take-home pay compared to the U.S. No question about that, even after you adjust for, the exchange rates in the Canadian versus the U.S. dollar. The big difference, though, is that in Canada, we don't have to pay that $7,000 plus out of pocket for health care that you're going to be paying in the U.S. because of our universal health care system. And, that's paid for directly by Canadians through our taxes. And that's why we're taxed at a higher rate in that sense, and we have less take-home pay. So you're going to pay for health care one way or the other, right? The difference is that in Canada, it's a universal healthcare system, so everyone's covered. And actually, even if you factor in the amount that we have to pay in taxes, we pay typically about half in healthcare costs through those payroll deductions that you pay out of pocket in the US. So by every metric and every study I've ever seen, we actually pay less per capita for the Canadian healthcare, access to the Canadian healthcare system. And that's a huge difference too, including the fact that all Canadians are covered, whereas there's millions of people, and some, the estimates vary, but maybe as many as 10% in the US who don't have any kind of insurance or health coverage at all. Another big difference would be the leave policies. And again, I noticed this right away when I came to Canada, when we had kids, and I was talking with my sister Lisa and her leave policies, and she actually just retired a little over a year ago, but she'd worked in the insurance industry, travelers, for almost 30 years. But the biggest difference that I saw between us is the fact that when she had her kids versus when we had our kids up here. And so the point is that in terms of family leave policies, Canada guarantees paid maternity and parental leave through the EI system for a minimum of 52 weeks, one full year, with total job security. And nowadays, and we didn't have this when I was, having kids, but you could also nowadays you can take up to 18 months, but with reduced coverage for each kid. So to be clear, you don't make your full salary, so you have to plan accordingly. In contrast, in the U.S., you're nowadays insured 12 weeks of paid leave if you're a federal employee, but there's no formal or universal policy apart from the Family and Medical Leave Act. You might be able to negotiate with your employee on the private side a better package in some cases. So anyway, that's a real difference between the countries as well. So I could go further into the statistics, but the bottom line is that you make more money on average in the U.S. and you have more take-home pay, unquestionably, in the U.S. than you do in Canada. the trade-off, of course, as I've briefly tried to explain, is that there's the downside, if you will, in the U.S. is that there's a much less robust social safety net, both in terms of health care and family leave policies in particular. And that includes for those who end up unemployed as well. Canada historically has had a slightly higher unemployment rate, sometimes considerably higher than the U.S. The gap has been relatively small in recent years, around 5.5% now in Canada versus 4% in the U.S. year before last. But if you do end up on the dole, as they say, you're covered up here in Canada for about 26 weeks. You're covered in the U.S. for 26 weeks. That's a half a year. And about 45 or up to 45 weeks in Canada, depending on your region and your work history. So there's a little bit more extensive coverage in that regard. But the other advantage in Canada, at least, is if you do happen to lose your job, you don't lose any health coverage, right? No matter what in Canada. So you're always going to be covered. And you really do then, in that sense, have a more secure safety net, shall we say, compared to the U.S. So it's a bit like rolling the dice. If you have the good fortune of having a solid education, and most importantly, a good or a stable job of some kind and access to private insurance, you can definitely earn more in the U.S. on average, and certainly live a very, you'll own your own home. You can live in a very nice place, have a high quality of life. And you might get up to 4 weeks of paid vacation too, depending on how long you've worked in the company and so on. In Canada, you don't have to make quite as much money in that sense. So and on average, you're not going to make as much as you are in the U.S. But the bottom line is that there's a more robust and comprehensive healthcare system and social safety net. So that's the big trade-off. And as I mentioned last week too, Canadians on average tend to enjoy about a week more of paid vacation than their American counterparts. So, but after the bills are paid, there are so many other factors that affect our quality of life, our personal preferences in terms of where we'd like to live. And I've not been to every corner of the U.S. and Canada, but I'm definitely working on it. And both countries are incredibly diverse, both in terms of their population bases, the cultural variation and diversity across the countries, and especially in terms of their environments and their physical landscapes. And as much as I'd like to travel to many other places around the world, and of course I'm only going to be able to go to a few places over the course of my lifetime, I'm confident that I'll probably not even get to travel to every single place I'd ideally like to go to just within Canada and the US because of their sheer size and diversity. And there's just so much to see. So we could take, a vacation every winter and every summer for the next 30 years and still not get to all the places I'd want to go to in both Canada and the US. So regardless of which country you live in, I think we can all agree that we are quite blessed and fortunate to live on these vast lands of North America, and the relative peace and security that we experience when we set off in our hikes, on our bikes, and in our cars, and however we decide to travel across these incredible lands. I know people who have crisscrossed both countries and have nothing but glowing things really to say about their experiences both within the United States and within Canada. Again, from the lands and the environments in general to the many incredible and diverse peoples that you're likely to encounter along the way. And a friend of mine and his partner, and this is just biked literally all the way across Canada, starting out on the west coast in BC, all the way to Newfoundland last summer, going about 100 to 150 miles a day, 100 to 150 kilometers per day, depending upon their schedule and their sightseeing, etc. So what an incredible journey. I don't know that I could do it, but you've got to be in great shape. You've got to plan. You've got to, I always worry about folks traveling, whether U.S. or Canada, on bikes along the highways. But as I understand it, in the case of Canada, there's only a few areas, a few stretches where you really have to travel directly on the highways, as opposed to on the shoulders that are oftentimes quite expanded, or there are alternative routes that parallel the highways where you can do the biking. I'm sure that's the case in the U.S. to a certain extent as well. But point is you really have to plan carefully in terms of if you're going to do that kind of a journey, regardless if you're talking about the U.S. or Canada, and figure out where the pit stops are, where you can stay overnight, et cetera, et cetera. But I would do it if I could. I had the opportunity in either or both countries. So we'll continue our journeys respectively, I'm sure. And as I say, there's a lot more I still want to see in both countries. I got a lot of work to do to get there. But thankfully, I'll have some holidays. I have more than enough holidays in my case because of the nature of my job, and enough income, again, because of the nature of my job, to be able to travel. So I feel, again, quite fortunate in that sense. So I have really nothing but gratitude, both for my experiences growing up in the U.S. and the education that I received there, and then for the second half of my life here in Canada, where we've been able to raise our family in relative comfort and security, not the lap of luxury. I wasn't born to, Bill Gates, or I wasn't one of Elon Musk's 13 children, obviously. Uh, those are the kinds of folks that, at least from a financial standpoint, will never have to want for anything, obviously. Most of us are, of course, in vastly different situations, and we live our middle class or lower middle class or maybe upper middle class lives. But thankfully, again, in both countries, in relative peace, security, and comfort, fairly high quality of life, and so forth. So much to be recommended for both, but from an economic and from a statistical standpoint, there are some clear similarities, but then there are some differences. And so you have to take all of these factors into account when you're deciding on where you want to live and in terms of the quality of life that you'd like to enjoy. But I really don't think you can go too far wrong in either case, regardless of whether you live north or south of the 49th parallel. All right, that's it for today. Thanks for watching. And as ever, may you and yours continue to create peace in your lives and nurture your love in your hearts. Give someone a hug who might need one, and we'll see you tomorrow.